Welcome back. In this mini lecture, we are going to take a look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and how they're involved in controlling the other glands of the endocrine system.
Let's remind ourselves what the hypothalamus does. First of all, let's remind ourselves anatomically that it is a collection of gray matter nuclei. These nuclei have 5 distinct functions. They control the autonomic nervous system. They integrate sensory signals which come in from the visceral nervous system, which is the sensory component of the ANS. And they send out motor commands to our smooth and cardiac muscles by the parasympathetic or sympathetic divisions. The ANS is the major regulator of visceral activities like heart rate and food movement through the GI tract, the contraction of the bladder, function of the respiratory system, of the reproductive system. So the hypothalamus is considered to be the control center of the autonomic nervous system. However, there are nuclei within the hypothalamus that produce hormones. These are going to be the oxytocin and vasopressin hormones. These 2 hormones are actually going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. But then you also have those 7 releasing and inhibiting hormones, which we're going to learn in a second. The hypothalamus regulates emotional and behavioral patterns. For example, it is responsible for rage, aggression, pain, and pleasure, and also plays a role in sexual arousal. Certain regions of the hypothalamus are responsible for regulating eating and regulating drinking. For example, the hypothalamus contains a thirst center, which is a cluster of neurons that responds to a rise in the osmotic pressure of blood plasma, and it also responds to a decrease in the volume of blood plasma. And both of these are going to happen upon dehydration. This will then tell you to drink. And finally, the hypothalamus controls body temperature. It is thought as working as the thermostat of the body. It is capable of monitoring the temperature of blood flowing through the hypothalamus, and it will set up specific body responses in order to alter our temperature, such as shivering to warm us up or sweating to cool us down. The pituitary gland is a pea-shaped half-inch gland, which is found sitting in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Specifically, it sits in a fossa called the hypophyseal fossa of that sella turcica region. It attaches to the hypothalamus through a structure which is called the infundibulum in some textbooks. I think in other textbooks it's called the median eminence. But it is a stalk which physically attaches the 2 lobes of the pituitary to the hypothalamus. Through that stalk, neurons will run. You will find axons which originate from the hypothalamus running through that stalk and terminating in the pituitary. Most of the pituitary gland is an anterior lobe which develops actually from the roof of the mouth. It's comprised of numerous types of cells. Each cell is going to be specific for making a certain hormone. The smaller lobe is the posterior lobe, and those neurons which originated in the hypothalamus, whose axons formed the infundibulum, these axons terminate in the posterior lobe, where the products from those neurons can be stored. The posterior lobe is specifically made up of neuroglial cells called pituocytes. The portion that marks the connection of the hypothalamus to the pituitary is that stalk-like structure called the median eminence. Near the start of the median eminence are going to be groups of neurons that are known as hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. These neurosecretory cells, their cell bodies originate in the hypothalamus. Their axons extend down into the anterior pituitary. So I'm going to draw their axons. They're shown in black, but I'm going to keep drawing them here as these red lines because I want you to see that they come into the posterior pituitary, and when they secrete their substances, their contents, those compounds are stored in the posterior pituitary. In particular, these neurosecretory cells that lead into the posterior pituitary are going to secrete the hormones oxytocin and vasopressin. And we're going to see what those do in a bit. But that's the job of the posterior pituitary. It is to store oxytocin and vasopressin, which is released by these hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. Now, there are going to be neurosecretory cells that are going to control the anterior pituitary, and we're going to see those in the next slide. The neurosecretory cells that control the anterior pituitary are going to make releasing and inhibiting hormones. And they don't have a direct connection to the anterior pituitary. So again, if I draw these axons right here as this little cluster, their axons are going to come down, but they are going to terminate actually at this system of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system. This is the system actually that is going to take these products, these hormonal products of those neurons down to the anterior pituitary so that the anterior pituitary cells can respond to it. Now, you may have heard of a portal system before. A portal system in anatomy is a system that connects two tissues directly without the heart being in between. So it would run like this. It would be heart to tissue number 1. The portal system would take it to tissue number 2, and then we would go back to the heart. That right there, where I'm going to put PS, that's your portal system. Typically what we have is we have a heart, we go to tissue number 1, we go back to the heart. That's your standard system. A portal system connects two tissues before going back to the heart. Now we have to admit this picture is a little better, right? Here we are at the hypothalamus at the top of this figure. We have a bunch of these neurosecretory cells. Notice we have one group here whose axons will then terminate in the posterior pituitary. These are the ones that are going to produce the hormones oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are stored in the posterior pituitary, but they're made by neurons that originate in the hypothalamus. Now, even though it's not shown here, on the other side here, I'm going to circle in blue, these are the neurosecretory cells that will send their hormonal products into this portal system, which I'm kind of drawing right here. That's going to be for the release of the releasing and inhibiting hormones. So those neurons are going to produce the releasing and inhibiting hormones that will get to the anterior pituitary by means of that portal system we just saw in the previous slide. So what are these releasing and inhibiting hormones? Well, they're hypothalamic hormones that tell the pituitary what to do. They, for example, will tell the pituitary to produce and release a specific hormone, or they will inhibit the pituitary from producing and releasing that hormone. Let's take an example. It's a pituitary hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary. It's called somatotropin. This, by the way, is called human growth hormone. So, the pituitary is incapable of acting on its own. It needs the hypothalamus to tell it what to do. The hypothalamus is monitoring the body, and it will realize when we need this hormone called somatotropin. When we do, it will produce a hormone called SRH, somatotropin releasing hormone. This will traffic down to the anterior pituitary using that portal system, and the anterior pituitary will produce somatotropin, or again, what is known as human growth hormone. There will come a point in time where we have enough of this hormone and we want to stop making it. In that case, we're going to have another hormone, again, coming from the hypothalamus called SIH, somatotropin inhibiting hormone. That will traffic down to the pituitary and it will shut off the production of this somatotropin / human growth hormone. This is the way the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. There are 7 releasing and inhibiting hormones. They are called somatotropin releasing hormone and somatotropin inhibiting hormone. Again, another word for somatotropin is growth hormone. So you might see growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. There is a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. There is a hormone called prolactin releasing hormone. And then there's another hormone called prolactin inhibiting hormone. Although, to be honest with you, you could also call prolactin inhibiting hormone dopamine because of the same thing. There's thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, and then we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to release the gonadotropins. This is a really nice figure that I found here. It shows you the hypothalamus. It shows you the pituitary hormones that are released as a result, and then it gives you the targets of these pituitary hormones. In the reading page, actually, you will see that I'm going to put not a figure, but I'm going to put a table up that, again, will summarize what's the hypothalamic hormone, what's the anterior pituitary hormone, what's the target of these pituitary hormones, and what do these tissues do. Because I'm going to throw a lot of releasing hormones at you, a lot of pituitary hormones at you. It's going to get a little confusing. So if you can refer to figures like this or the table in the reading page, I think that'll help you learn all of this material a little easier. Well, what does that mean? The posterior pituitary does not make hormones. It stores the hormones oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, specifically these cells make up the nuclei called the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. They produce oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So these two nuclei right here are going to make oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Their neurons in yellow will travel down to the posterior pituitary where oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone get stored. So those are 2 of the 9 hormones that the pituitary releases. The other hormones that the pituitary releases are going to be shown right here. Now those are the hormones that we are actually going to look at. I will tell you there's one hormone which is missing. We don't have melanocyte stimulating hormone, and I think everything else is there, but we are missing melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. But to be honest with you, that's kind of an unimportant hormone that we really honestly don't understand. But let's now concentrate on these hormones coming from the anterior pituitary. And here they are. Human growth hormone, otherwise known as somatotropin. Thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of these are collectively referred to as the gonadotropins. Prolactin, adrenocorticotropin, or ACTH. You can also call that corticotropin if you don't want to call it ACTH. And melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. Each of these 7 hormones comes from 5 types of cells. The anterior pituitary is made up of the following cell types: somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, lactotrophs, and corticotrophs. The somatotrophs make the human growth hormone, or somatotropin. The thyrotrophs make thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin. The gonadotrophs make the 2 gonadotropins, FSH and LH. Lactotrophs make prolactin, and the corticotrophs secrete ACTH, or what you can call corticotropin, plus they also secrete and release melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now notice, the cells end in the word troph. The hormones end in the word tropin. Let's go over the control of secretion by the anterior pituitary. The first level of pituitary regulation comes from the hypothalamus. It is the releasing and inhibiting hormones that the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus make and dump into the hypophyseal portal system, which is going to take them down to the anterior pituitary. So let's use a hormone as an example. Let's use corticotropin releasing hormone as our example and how it controls the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. The corticotropin is going to come from a specific group of neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. Again, they are going to get dumped into the hypophyseal portal system, which isn't shown here in this figure. But that hypophyseal portal system is going to supply the cells of the anterior pituitary. The corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary are going to receive this CRH message and are going to respond accordingly by producing
ACTH, otherwise known as corticotropin, and dumping that into the bloodstream.
The second level I'm about to show you is your typical negative feedback mechanism. The corticotropin that is released from the anterior pituitary specifically acts on the adrenal cortex. And when the adrenal cortex receives the corticotropin message, it produces a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol levels need to be maintained in a specific value within our bloodstream. When cortisol levels climb higher than normal, this is now going to set up your standard negative feedback mechanism. And this, in this case, is going to be a 2-point negative feedback interaction. The first interaction is going to be telling the hypothalamus to stop making its releasing hormone. And the second level of negative feedback interaction is going to be the pituitary stopping and releasing corticotropin. So both of these interaction sites happen at the same time. This is going to shut the mechanism off, and cortisol levels will eventually drop down below to normal. And if they happen to drop below normal, this system will turn back on again. Okay, let's take a look now at each of these anterior pituitary hormones. We'll start off with human growth hormone, otherwise known as somatotropin. It is produced by the pituitary cells known as somatotrophs. Again, the cell ends in troph, the hormone ends in tropin. The hypothalamic signal for this is growth hormone releasing hormone, or you can call it somatotropin releasing hormone. In response, the pituitary will produce and release human growth hormone from its somatotroph cells. Now, what does human growth hormone do? It promotes the synthesis of a growth factor called somatomedin, or insulin-like growth factor 1. The target of human growth hormone, believe it or not, is the liver, the skeletal muscles, cartilage, and bone. But its main target is the liver, and the liver produces large amounts of IGF. Now, the common target cells for IGF are the liver, the skeletal muscle, the cartilage, and bone. So this is a little bit of autocrine action going on. So it's pretty interesting that human growth hormone will tell things like our skeletal muscle, our cartilage, and our bone to increase by increasing their growth of their cells, by increasing their production of proteins, by increasing their numbers through mitosis. But it doesn't do it directly. So in other words, human growth hormone can't go to skeletal muscle and say, I need you to grow bigger and stronger. It needs IGF in order to do that. And most of the IGF that targets these tissues comes from the liver, but keep in mind that the tissue itself can also make its own IGF. So again, that's an autocrine action.
What are some other things that human growth hormone does? Well, one of the major things it also does is it promotes the breakdown of lipids, which is called lipolysis. This lipolysis can be done by adipose tissue. So human growth hormone will signal adipose tissue to begin to break down their lipid stores. Remember, a lipid is known as a triglyceride, is a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So when adipose tissue begins to break down its triglycerides, it breaks it down into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Those get dumped into the bloodstream. The glycerol can be used by any cell in the glycolytic pathway to make ATP. Fatty acids can be used by cells in cellular respiration to make ATP. If you remember a long time ago, I may have mentioned that fatty acids can get converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and then that acetyl coenzyme A can come into the Krebs cycle. But a reminder to you, fatty acids cannot be used to make ATP synthesis unless you have enough oxygen being supplied to that cell. So fatty acids can be used for aerobic production of ATP synthesis. Human growth hormone stimulates the release of glucose into the bloodstream by the liver. So it will stimulate our liver to break down their glycogen stores and release that glucose into the bloodstream. So human growth hormone actually will raise blood glucose levels. It can specifically retard the use of glucose by many of our tissues for ATP production so that our blood glucose levels remain high enough to supply our brain and supply growing tissues. People who abuse human growth hormone can develop diabetes. And the reason why we need this glucose is for our growing tissues to take in that glucose and produce ATP. Human growth hormone has an anabolic effect. It specifically can increase things like bone and muscle mass, and those tissues, as they begin to grow, are going to need increased ATP for their function. So growing tissues can use that glucose. However, if you're not a growing tissue, you're not going to use that glucose, so that things like new tissue production get that glucose and our brain get that glucose. Human growth hormone secretion is promoted by things like lowered fatty acid levels in the blood, lowered amino acid levels in the blood. If our blood sugar levels drop too low, one of the hormones made can be human growth hormone. Human growth hormone secretion is maximized during our third and fourth non-REM sleep stages, so it is stimulated during deep sleep. Increased human growth hormone production and release can be stimulated by increased activity by the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight system. Makes sense, because then we are going to have the breakdown of fat and glycogen dumping in things like glucose and fatty acids that we can use for ATP synthesis. And there are numerous other hormones that can actually cause human growth hormone production and release. Things like glucagon can do it, estrogen, cortisol, and insulin. Adults secrete about 400 micrograms of human growth hormone a day, but adolescents will secrete about twice that.
One of the body signals that can stimulate the release of human growth hormone will be low blood sugar. In response to low blood sugar, our hypothalamus secretes its releasing hormone, GHRH. The anterior pituitary releases more of its human growth hormone in response. The human growth hormone traffics to things like the liver, the skeletal muscle, the bones. They stimulate release of IGF. The IGF then feeds back in an autocrine mechanism to signal to those tissues. In response, the liver breaks down glycogen into glucose, so we get increased blood glucose levels. Things like the cartilage, the skeletal muscle, and the bone, they are going to respond to IGF by increasing their division, so they increase their cell numbers, they increase their protein synthesis, so they get bigger. But let's concentrate on that increased blood glucose, because now that's the signal to shut the system off. With increased blood glucose levels, with hyperglycemia, it inhibits the release of more releasing hormone, and it actually triggers the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So we have a little bit of a negative feedback. That's the green thing here. So we negatively feed back here to the hypothalamus, but then we also start another system, which is going to be the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That is again going to help shut this system down by inhibiting the release of human growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. As a result, blood glucose levels will actually come back down to normal, and this system will shut off. So it's kind of a two-tiered system, isn't it? You have a negative feedback system with high blood glucose, which shuts off the releasing hormone, but you have another system which turns on, which is controlled by the inhibiting hormone. When blood glucose levels again drop low, we have a negative feedback system back to the inhibiting hormone. We shut that off and we turn on the releasing hormone. So it's a balance, isn't it? You either have the releasing hormone and no inhibiting hormone, or it's the other way around. So as I mentioned a couple slides ago, you don't necessarily want to go off and take large amounts of human growth hormone. Human growth hormone increases blood glucose levels so that the brain has plenty of glucose to make its ATP. If you continue to expose yourself to an excess of human growth hormone, it causes a diabetogenic effect. It causes type 1 diabetes. Because of the raised blood glucose concentration, the pancreas increases its release of insulin, and if that is a continual release of insulin, it could eventually result in the burnout of the beta cells, the cells that actually make insulin. You become a type 1 diabetic. It is possible, though, that you can undersecrete human growth hormone. This in childhood is going to result in what is called pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism just results in people with extremely small stature. They are proportional in their limbs and trunk size, but they have like a childlike body and childlike height. These kids that suffer from pituitary dwarfism under doctors' close supervision can be given human growth hormone injections. But again, these have to be closely monitored because an excess of human growth hormone can lead to diabetes. There are disorders when these feedback mechanisms again get all out of whack. There are hypersecretion disorders. If it happens during childhood, it can lead to what is called giantism. If you have hypersecretion as an adult, it can lead to acromegaly, which leads to a growth of hands, feet, facial features, and a thickening of the skin. So I imagine there are a lot of athletes out there who have taken human growth hormone and thought they could get away with it. But I imagine those athletes have slightly bigger hands, feet, and heads. So I guess if you actually looked at an athlete, say for example a baseball player who took human growth hormone supplements, I imagine one sign that they took it would be that their helmet size started to increase over the years. I don't think your head grows because you're, eating well and exercising in the gym. I think your head grows because you're shooting human growth hormone into your rear end. Okay, prolactin. Signal from the hypothalamus is called prolactin releasing hormone. Its target are the lactotroph cells of the anterior pituitary. These actually are the most actively dividing cells in the female pituitary gland. They also will respond to thyrotropin releasing hormone, but let's just concentrate on prolactin releasing hormone. Tells the anterior pituitary lactotrophs to produce prolactin. It is true that prolactin is also produced by breast tissue, but that's during pregnancy and after pregnancy. Now, lactotrophs are normally inhibited in the non-pregnant female. This is because there is a certain level of dopamine secretion coming from the hypothalamus. Specifically, the neurons that produce dopamine originate in the arcuate nucleus, and you can actually call dopamine prolactin inhibiting hormone if you would like, because they are one and the same thing. How does prolactin work? Well, it's a positive feedback mechanism. Suckling at the nipple will stimulate the release of prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That will tell the anterior pituitary to release its prolactin. Prolactin will travel to the breast tissue and it will stimulate actually milk production. Now this happens when pregnant. During pregnancy, prolactin stimulates the development of mammary tissue, as after birth it will stimulate the production of milk. During pregnancy, there are high enough levels of estrogen. This actually contributes to prolactin production. And during pregnancy, high levels of progesterone prevent milk letdown. So there's kind of a permissive effect between estrogen and prolactin during pregnancy, and there's an antagonistic effect between progesterone and prolactin. When suckling while suckling increases PRH production, suckling also decreases prolactin inhibiting hormone levels. So we get rid of the antagonist to PRH because of suckling. Prolactin levels are going to rise along with milk production. Now, I don't want you to confuse milk production caused by prolactin with milk letdown. Milk letdown is actually going to require another hormone in this complicated mechanism. It's called oxytocin. But for now, we're just going to concentrate on prolactin and the fact that during pregnancy, it promotes the stimulation of mammary tissue so that that mammary tissue can produce milk. While the suckling promotes the release of prolactin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and it prevents the release of prolactin-inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus, there's a third hormone here, and I just mentioned it. It's called oxytocin. Stimulation of the hypothalamus by suckling signals the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. And oxytocin stimulates the contraction of the myoepithelial cells in the mammary gland, so you get milk ejection. So breastfeeding requires two hormones. It requires prolactin so that the breast makes milk, and it requires oxytocin so that the milk can be ejected through the nipple. By the way, prolactin and oxytocin also contribute to the female orgasm. It can lead to proliferation of oligodendrocytes in the brain. and they also provide feelings of sexual gratification after intercourse. These hormones can counteract dopamine, which is one of the hormones of sexual arousal, and it produces what is called a sexual refractory period. So after intercourse, there is no desire to have intercourse again. A lot of people refer to prolactin and oxytocin as the cuddling hormones. Oxytocin has even been called the falling in love hormone. Overproduction and hypersecretion disorders are often caused by drugs that antagonize dopamine. Remember, dopamine is known as prolactin inhibiting hormone. If you counteract that, which is the normal situation, prolactin releasing hormone will get made, and you will end up with an overstimulation of breast tissue. So remember, the normal situation is prolactin inhibiting hormone is on 99.9% of the time until you're pregnant, and then prolactin inhibiting hormone shuts off, prolactin releasing hormone turns on. So overproduction of prolactin means you've removed that prolactin inhibiting hormones part of the mechanism. For example, a drug called Zyprexa, which I think is treated for schizophrenia, actually can cause this. Underproduction is usually caused because the lactotroph portion, the lactotroph cells die. There is something called Sheehan syndrome, which is known as postpartum hypopituitarism. This actually can happen due to life-threatening blood loss, for example, during childbirth. The hypoxia can lead to necrosis of the pituitary, and the loss of those lactotrophs leads to Sheehan syndrome, thus leading to an underproduction of prolactin. Galactorrhea is really interesting. This is a disorder which results in milk production when not breastfeeding. There are hormones in certain medicines that can cause this. Herbs like fennel and anise can cause this. Marijuana can cause this. It's probably most often caused by pituitary tumors. Now remember, prolactin is going to require oxytocin for the actual milk letdown response. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also called thyrotropin. The hypothalamic signal is going to be thyrotropin releasing hormone. That's going to travel down to the thyrotroph cells in the anterior pituitary. These are going to produce thyrotropin, otherwise known as TSH. TSH stimulates the synthesis and secretion of the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 from the thyroid gland. And as a result, metabolic rate can go up. How? Well, we're going to see that in the last mini lecture when we take a look at the thyroid gland. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is in the next slide, are going to be your gonadotropins. So the hypothalamic signal is going to be GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is going to control the activity of your pituitary's gonadotrophs. The gonadotrophs are going to release follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. FSH actually has roles in both the ovaries and the testes. So for example, it initiates the formation of follicles within the ovary. It stimulates these follicle cells to eventually secrete estrogen. And FSH has a very important role in sperm production or spermatogenesis in the testes. In females, luteinizing hormone stimulates the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum. It also stimulates ovulation of the secondary oocyte from the ovary. We're going to see that when we get to the reproductive system. So you're going to have to hold off a little bit on this, but luteinizing hormone is really important in the production of the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone from a structure called the corpus luteum. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the interstitial cells of the testes to secrete testosterone. Adrenocorticotropin, otherwise known as corticotropin. Hypothalamic signal is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which is going to act on the corticotrophs of the pituitary. These corticotrophs are going to secrete ACTH, otherwise known as corticotropin, and also another hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone. ACTH is going to stimulate cells of the adrenal cortex to produce glucocorticoids. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is also secreted by the corticotroph cells along with ACTH. It's actually not known a lot of what MSH does. It does have some skin darkening effects. This can be increased during pregnancy. This can also be increased in certain women that take the birth control pill. There are some anti-MSH creams which have been used as a treatment for melanoma. I don't know how successful they are. I think if they were more successful, we would hear more about them, but there are some creams out there to basically prevent the darkening of the skin and to treat melanomas. MSH is also secreted by the hypothalamus. It has a role in appetite and sexual arousal. We'll finish up with the posterior pituitary gland. And you can see here it's in bold and red. This does not synthesize hormones. This is a hormone storage site. These are going to be for the hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. They are released by very specific neurosecretory cells that originate in the hypothalamus. So these, you can see in this picture, these neurons form the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Their axons travel through the median eminence infundibulum, and they end up in the posterior pituitary. And when they release antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, the posterior pituitary stores it. Oxytocin actually has a role in smooth muscle contraction. So it can play a role in the milk letdown response by the myoepithelial cells of the breast, but it also has a very important role in childbirth. During delivery, when the baby's head comes into the birth canal and stretches the cervix, it actually releases, it is a signal for the release of oxytocin. That oxytocin causes the contraction of the uterine smooth muscle. That pushes the head further into the cervix, which stretches it more, which causes the release of more oxytocin, which causes more uterine smooth muscle contraction, which pushes the head further into the cervix, stretching it, etc., etc. That is your standard positive feedback cascade. After delivery, this positive feedback cascade will stop instantly once the baby is delivered. I think there's a smaller response when the placenta is being delivered. Now, after delivery, oxytocin plays a role in milk ejection, again, on those myoepithelial cells of the breast. The physical act of suckling can stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release its stored oxytocin, and you get milk ejection. Even hearing a baby's cry can stimulate milk ejection from breastfeeding females. We'll finish up with antidiuretic hormone, which is also called vasopressin. This is a hormone we will learn more about in the last lecture of this course on the excretory system. It functions to decrease urine production. It functions to decrease sweating. It basically functions in decreasing the amount of water that we lose by urinating and sweating. And if we don't lose those fluids will probably end up back in the blood. So it will increase blood volume and increase blood pressure. When we are dehydrated, a pretty good amount of antidiuretic hormone gets released so that we don't lose the water we do have to urination. When we are overhydrated, antidiuretic hormone release is inhibited, and now our kidneys can pick up and get rid of that excess water through urination, and our sweat glands can get rid of that excess water through sweating. The last mini lecture in this series is going to be on the peripheral endocrine organs. So now that we've learned what the pituitary hormones are, we are now going to go see their targeted tissues and find out what those targeted tissues do. Many of them are endocrine organs that will respond to the anterior pituitary by producing hormones of their own.